The curse of hatred is not a technique, nor a spell, nor a fate imposed from the outside. It is a pattern of emotion, belief, and memory that formed slowly over generations, shaping the Uchiha clan from its very beginning. To understand it is not to condemn the Uchiha, but to understand the quiet weight they carried long before the world learned to fear their eyes. The origins of the curse of hatred begin not with violence, but with love. The Uchiha descended from Indra Ōtsutsuki, the elder son of Hagoromo, the sage of 6 paths. Indra was gifted with immense spiritual energy and a sharp, analytical mind. He believed deeply in self-reliance, strength earned through effort, and the idea that power was the natural result of determination. Unlike his younger brother Asura, Indra did not seek connection instinctively. He sought understanding through mastery. Hagoromo never rejected Indra, but when the time came to choose a successor, he entrusted his will to Asura instead, believing that cooperation and love were the foundation of peace. Indra perceived this not as disagreement, but as betrayal. In that moment, a seed was planted, an idea that effort could be ignored, that love could be conditional, and that recognition could be denied no matter how hard one worked. This belief echoed forward through time. The Uchiha inherited Indra's intensity, his depth of feeling, and his desire to be seen and acknowledged. Unlike many clans who trained emotional restraint, the Uchiha experienced emotion more vividly. Their love was profound, consuming, and absolute. When they formed bonds, they did so completely. Family was not just lineage. It was identity. This is where the curse of hatred truly begins. Because when love is that deep, loss becomes unbearable. The Sharingan itself is born not from ambition, but from trauma. It awakens in moments of extreme emotional shock, often grief, fear, or despair. The eye that later became synonymous with power was originally a response to pain. The Uchiha did not seek strength for its own sake. Strength arrived uninvited, triggered by moments they could not emotionally survive unchanged. To awaken the Sharingan was to remember something that hurt too deeply to forget. As generations passed, the Uchiha became known for their power. But power was never the core of their philosophy. At the heart of the clan was an unspoken truth. The stronger the bond, the greater the suffering when it breaks. This created a paradox. The Uchiha loved deeply, but the world taught them that love would inevitably be taken away. This shaped how the clan saw reality. Where others learned to accept loss as part of life, the Uchiha struggled to do so. They did not let go easily. Grief lingered. Anger hardened. Memories replayed endlessly. The curse of hatred was not sudden rage. It was grief left unresolved, echoing until it transformed into something sharper. Over time, the Uchiha learned a dangerous lesson. If love leads to pain, then pain can become purpose. Hatred, unlike grief, feels active. It gives direction. It provides clarity when loss feels meaningless. Many Uchiha found that hatred dulled the ache of sorrow, replacing helplessness with resolve. This did not make them evil. It made them functional in a world that repeatedly demanded they endure unbearable loss. The clan's history reinforced this cycle. During the Warring States era, Uchiha, children were raised in constant proximity to death. Parents were lost early. Siblings died young. Rival clans targeted them precisely because of their emotional bonds, knowing that killing one Uchiha could destabilize many. The world taught them again and again that attachment was a liability. Yet they could not stop loving. This contradiction became central to the Uchiha philosophy. They believed strength was necessary not just to protect others, but to prevent the pain that came from helplessness. Power became a shield against grief. Control became a defense against chaos. Madara Uchiha understood this deeply. As a child, Madara lost nearly all his siblings to war. Each death carved into him a lesson that the world was fundamentally broken. When he finally found peace through friendship with Hashirama Senju, it felt miraculous, proof that suffering could end. But when that peace failed, the loss was unbearable. For Madara, the problem was not that peace was impossible. It was that it was fragile. The curse of hatred is born precisely here, in the belief that fragile things are not worth trusting. That if love can be destroyed, then only something unbreakable should replace it. This belief echoed from Indra to Madara, from Madara to Obito, from Obito to Sasuke. Each generation inherited not just power, but a question. How do you protect what you love in a world that constantly takes it away? Some Uchiha answered with isolation, others with dominance. Some sought control over the world itself. But beneath every answer was the same fear, the fear of loving something that could be lost again. This is why the curse of hatred is misunderstood. It is not an addiction to violence. It is an aversion to vulnerability. It is the refusal to feel powerless in the face of loss ever again. The Uchiha did not hate because they were cruel. They hated because they remembered too much. And as the clan moved closer to the era of the hidden villages, this unresolved grief would collide with systems that misunderstood it, feared it, and ultimately tried to contain it. The curse of hatred did not make the Uchiha monsters. It made them human in a world that demanded they stop being so. As the legacy of Indra passed quietly through generations, the Uchiha philosophy continued to form not through written doctrine, but through lived experience. By the time the Warring States era fully took shape, the curse of hatred was no longer an abstract inheritance. It had become a way of interpreting the world. The Warring States era was defined by instability. There were no villages, no alliances that lasted, no laws that endured longer than the strength required to enforce them. Children were born into conflict so constant that peace felt unnatural. For the Uchiha, this environment amplified every emotional trait they already possessed. Uchiha children learned early that love was dangerous. Families were tight-knit, often isolated within larger encampments, bound by shared blood and shared fear. Parents taught their children not just combat, but vigilance. Bonds were encouraged, yet every bond came with an unspoken warning. Anyone you care for may be gone tomorrow. Anyone you trust may be taken from you. This tension created a unique emotional discipline. The Uchiha did not suppress emotion. Instead, they learned to carry it quietly. Grief was not openly mourned for long, because survival demanded motion. Loss became internalized. Memories were stored rather than released. Over time, this internalization turned emotion inward, where it fermented. The Sharingan responded to this environment perfectly. It awakened not during moments of ambition, but during moments of rupture. Watching a sibling die, seeing a parent fall, being unable to protect someone important. The eye manifested as a reflection of helplessness, transforming emotional overload into heightened perception. In this way, power became inseparable from trauma. Unlike other clans who pursued strength through repetition and physical mastery alone, the Uchiha grew stronger through emotional extremes. Each tragedy deepened their capacity for power, reinforcing a subconscious association between loss and advancement. This association was never acknowledged openly, but it shaped how the clan understood progress. Pain became proof of growth. As the wars dragged on, rival clans began to notice this pattern. The Uchiha were not just dangerous fighters, they were unpredictable. Their strength fluctuated, sometimes exploding suddenly after personal loss. This unpredictability inspired fear, and fear bred preemptive hostility. The world began to treat the Uchiha as a threat before they acted. This external suspicion fed directly into the curse of hatred. The clan learned that no matter how disciplined or restrained they were, they would be watched, distrusted, anticipated. The more powerful they became, the more isolated they felt. Isolation became confirmation. The belief slowly took hold that the world would never fully accept them, that even peace would come with conditions, that trust was temporary. This belief did not originate from arrogance, but from observation repeated over decades. The Uchiha did not think themselves superior. They thought themselves misunderstood. This distinction mattered deeply to their philosophy. They believed the world feared them, not because they were evil, but because they were intense, because they loved deeply, because they remembered everything, and because they could not forget loss as easily as others seemed to. Within the clan, this belief fostered a sense of quiet solidarity. Only another Uchiha could fully understand an Uchiha. Only someone who had felt love turn into grief could comprehend the depth of their emotions. This internal understanding strengthened bonds within the clan, but further distanced them from outsiders. The curse of hatred at this stage was not hatred directed outward. It was a slow withdrawal inward. As years passed, some Uchiha attempted to resist this pattern. They sought balance, restraint, even peace. But the structure of the era punished vulnerability. Those who hesitated died. Those who trusted lost everything. Survival rewarded decisiveness, not empathy. This environment shaped Madara and Izuna. Their childhood was marked by repeated loss. Brother after brother fell to war. Each death reinforced a lesson that the world was merciless and unchanging. When Madara awakened his Sharingan, it was not celebrated. It was understood. A silent acknowledgement that he had crossed a threshold no child should have to cross. Madara's love for Izuna became absolute. Izuna was not just family. He was purpose. He was proof that something still mattered in a world that took everything else. This bond became the emotional core around which Madara's worldview formed. When Izuna later died, entrusting his eyes to Madara, the loss was not merely personal. It was philosophical. Madara concluded that the world itself was flawed. That peace, based on trust, could never endure. That as long as people felt pain, they would inflict it on others. This was not hatred for its own sake. It was grief, transformed into certainty. The curse of hatred crystallized here. Hatred became clarity. It simplified the world. It replaced chaos with structure, pain with purpose. In a world where love could be shattered, hatred felt stable. But even now, the Uchiha did not abandon love. They buried it. Love became something dangerous to expose, something that had to be guarded or redirected. Some Uchiha channeled it into loyalty to the clan, others into ideology, others into ambition. The emotional intensity never disappeared. It only changed form. This is why the curse of hatred persisted. It was never addressed at its source. Grief was endured, not healed. Loss was accepted as inevitable, not mourned fully. Over generations, this unresolved sorrow accumulated, waiting for moments of collapse to surface again. By the time the era of villages approached, the Uchiha carried centuries of emotional residue. They were not simply warriors. They were archivists of pain. And when the possibility of peace finally emerged, it would challenge everything the curse of hatred had taught them about the world. The founding of Konohagakure represented the first true challenge to the curse of hatred, not because it offered power or victory, but because it offered something far more dangerous to the Uchiha worldview: the possibility that the world could change. For centuries, the Uchiha had learned that pain was inevitable, that conflict was constant, and that loss was the natural conclusion of attachment. Peace had never existed long enough to be trusted. And so when Hashirama Senju extended his hand to Madara Uchiha, the gesture was not received as hope, but as uncertainty. Madara and Hashirama were bound by an understanding that predated politics or clans. As children, they had met without names, without banners, and without inherited hatred, sharing stones across a river, while speaking quietly about dreams that felt impossible even as they were spoken. For Madara, this connection was rare and profound, a moment of safety in a world defined by loss. For a time, it allowed him to imagine that strength and compassion could coexist without one destroying the other. But the curse of hatred does not disappear when peace appears. It waits, observing, measuring, remembering everything that has been lost before. When the Senju and Uchiha agreed to form a village together, Madara did not see an end to suffering. He saw the beginning of a new vulnerability. The Uchiha were being asked to lay down the emotional armor they had forged over generations and trust a system that had never protected them before. Even as the village grew, even as children began training together rather than killing one another, Madara watched carefully for signs of imbalance, for proof that this peace was conditional and temporary. The curse of hatred sharpened his perception. It reminded him that power structures always tilt toward someone, that equality rarely survives fear, and that systems built on ideals often collapse under reality. Madara noticed the subtle shift as Hashirama was chosen as Hokage. Not because Madara desired the title for himself, but because the decision echoed Indra's ancient wound. Once again, someone defined by love and connection was chosen over someone shaped by discipline and resolve. Once again, effort and sacrifice seemed secondary to emotional appeal. This was not jealousy. It was recognition. Madara interpreted the moment not as personal rejection, but as confirmation that the world had not changed at all. The curse of hatred whispered that the village was simply a larger version of the same system that had failed the Uchiha for centuries. It warned him that the clan would be tolerated only as long as they were useful, that their power would always be feared, and that peace would end the moment fear outweighed convenience. While Hashirama believed peace could be maintained through mutual trust, Madara believed trust was fragile by design. He did not see hatred as the enemy of peace, but as the inevitable result of broken trust. To him, suppressing hatred without addressing its cause was the true danger. The curse of hatred was not something to be erased. It was something to be acknowledged and controlled. As the village stabilized, Madara became increasingly isolated. Other Uchiha, exhausted by war and eager to protect their children, chose to believe in the village. They saw in Konoha a chance to end the cycle of suffering. Madara saw a pause, not an ending. This divergence marked a crucial evolution in the curse of hatred. For the first time, the clan itself became divided between those willing to risk vulnerability and those unwilling to forget the past. Madara's departure from Konoha was not an act of betrayal, but of despair. He could not accept a peace that required him to ignore everything he had learned about the world. Leaving the village was his attempt to preserve the Uchiha from what he believed was an inevitable collapse. In his mind, walking away was not abandonment. It was vigilance. When Madara later returned as an enemy, the curse of hatred had fully transformed. It was no longer passive grief or internalized sorrow. It had become ideology. Madara believed the world itself was structured to produce suffering, and that no village, no alliance, and no goodwill could prevent that outcome. The cycle of hatred, in his view, was not a failure of people, but a feature of reality. This belief led him to the concept of imposed peace. If free will inevitably produced conflict, then perhaps free will itself was the problem. The infinite Tsukuyomi was not conceived as domination, but as mercy. Madara believed that a dream without loss was kinder than a reality defined by pain. This belief was the curse of hatred at its most evolved form. Hatred no longer directed outward, but turned against reality itself. Yet even here, love remained. Madara's actions were driven by memory, by siblings lost, by friendships broken, by trust that failed. The curse of hatred did not erase his capacity for love. It convinced him that love needed to be protected from the world by any means necessary. In this way, hatred and compassion became indistinguishable within him. The tragedy of the Uchiha philosophy is not that it embraces hatred, but that it cannot accept uncertainty. The idea that peace might fail is unbearable, so it must be replaced with something absolute. The curse of hatred demands certainty in a world that offers none. As Madara's influence faded and the village moved forward without him, the curse of hatred did not disappear. It receded, settling into the subconscious of the clan, waiting for the next generation to encounter loss that could not be reconciled. And when that loss came, it would not arrive as ideology, but as heartbreak. After Madara Uchiha vanished from the village and from recorded history, the curse of hatred did not erupt, dissolve, or resolve itself in any dramatic fashion. It simply remained. Peace arrived in Konohagakure not as a gradual healing, but as an abrupt shift, a sudden replacement of constant warfare with structure, law, and routine. For many clans, this transition felt like relief. For the Uchiha, it felt unfinished, as though the world had decided the suffering was over without ever asking whether it had been understood. The Uchiha had lived for generations in a reality where vigilance was not a choice, but a necessity, where every attachment carried risk, and where loss was frequent enough to become expected. When that reality ended, it did not take their emotional framework with it. The war stopped, but the memories did not. The dead were not replaced by peace, only by silence. The curse of hatred adapted immediately, shifting from an outward response to conflict into an inward method of survival. Konohagakure began to grow into a true village, its streets filling with children who would never know the sound of nightly alarms or the fear of sudden clan extermination. Training grounds replaced battlefields. Missions replaced raids. Laws replaced instinct. Yet the Uchiha, perhaps more than any other clan, carried the knowledge of how quickly systems collapsed. They had watched alliances crumble before. They had watched promises fail. Peace, to them, was not a conclusion, but a pause whose duration was unknown. This uncertainty shaped how the curse of hatred evolved. Where it once manifested through emotional extremes and explosive loss, it now became restraint. The Uchiha learned to control themselves not because they trusted the world, but because they did not. Discipline replaced expression. Observation replaced openness. The clan adapted to village life by participating fully in its structure while remaining emotionally distant from its ideals. Loyalty became procedural rather than heartfelt. Duty replaced belonging. The assignment of the Uchiha clan to oversee the Konoha military police force formalized this distance in a way that could not be ignored. Publicly, it was framed as recognition of their strength, their reliability, and their ability to maintain order. Privately, it reinforced separation. Policing meant watching others rather than standing beside them, enforcing laws rather than shaping them, and existing as a presence of authority rather than community. The Uchiha were made guardians of stability, but not its architects. The curse of hatred understood this arrangement immediately. It recognized the familiar pattern of being trusted with responsibility while denied intimacy. The physical relocation of the Uchiha compound to the outskirts of the village echoed this role perfectly. Distance was no longer metaphorical. It was geographic. The clan lived close enough to protect the village, yet far enough to remain apart from its daily emotional life. This separation was never announced as punishment, yet it functioned as quiet containment. Within the clan, emotional expression continued to narrow. Losses still occurred. Shinobi still died on missions. Children still grew up without parents. But grief was handled privately and efficiently. There was little room for prolonged mourning. The Sharingan still awakened in moments of intense emotional trauma. But these moments were no longer communal. They were acknowledged quietly, discussed briefly, and then folded back into routine. Pain was not processed. It was stored. This suppression reshaped Uchiha identity over time. Grief that is never released does not fade. It becomes expectation. Each generation learned that attachment was dangerous even in peace, that trust required caution, and that emotional vulnerability was a liability. Endurance became the highest virtue. Silence became a sign of maturity. The curse of hatred no longer needed to whisper loudly. It lived in habit, posture, and restraint. The village interpreted this composure as stability. As Tobirama Senju assumed leadership, the emotional divide between the village's ideals and the Uchiha's reality widened further. Tobirama believed deeply in systems, laws, and preventative structure. He respected the Uchiha's power, but he feared its unpredictability, particularly the emotional catalyst behind the Sharingan. His policies were not driven by cruelty, but by calculation. Yet calculation, when applied unevenly, becomes mistrust. For the Uchiha, intent mattered less than outcome. The curse of hatred does not require persecution to grow. It feeds on implication. Every surveillance measure, every contingency plan, every quiet assumption that the Uchiha required special oversight reinforced the belief that they were not equal participants in the village's future. This belief was never shouted. It was absorbed slowly, through tone rather than language, through structure rather than decree. Inside the clan, a collective understanding formed without ever being spoken aloud. They knew their history would never fully release them. They were asked to forget the war, yet never allowed to escape its shadow. Their power was praised, but its origin was feared. Their loyalty was valued, but their emotions were regarded as a potential threat. This contradiction became central to their identity. For children born into this era, the curse of hatred manifested not as memory, but as atmosphere. They inherited stories of loss without witnessing them, absorbing emotional gravity without context. They learned early which questions led nowhere, which emotions were better hidden, and which thoughts should never be voiced outside the clan. Silence became cultural inheritance. This was the most enduring form the curse had ever taken. Hatred no longer required trauma to ignite. It lived quietly in anticipation, in the belief that belonging was conditional and acceptance temporary. It shaped how Uchiha viewed authority, loyalty, and the future, teaching them to prepare emotionally for rejection before it arrived. Peace did not dissolve the curse. It gave it time to deepen. By the time the next generation came of age, the curse of hatred was no longer reactive or volatile. It was patient, embedded within the village's structure and the clan's psychology alike. It waited beneath routine and order, beneath discipline and duty, accumulating weight through silence rather than conflict. And when it finally surfaced again, it would not do so as sudden rebellion or uncontrollable rage. It would emerge as inevitability, carried by those who had been raised to endure without release, shaped by a peace that demanded they suppress everything that once made their suffering visible. As time passed and generations shifted, the curse of hatred entered a new phase, one defined not by memory of war, but by the quiet tension of living within a system that never fully trusted you. This was the era of Fugaku Uchiha's generation, a period where the Uchiha were no longer shaped directly by battlefield trauma, but by the psychological strain of prolonged exclusion. The wounds of the past were no longer fresh, yet they remained open beneath the surface, never given the space to heal. Fugaku Uchiha grew up in a village that called itself peaceful, Yet he inherited the emotional residue of centuries of conflict. He did not experience the chaos of the warring states era firsthand, but he was raised by those who had, and their silence spoke louder than stories ever could. He learned early that the Uchiha were expected to be disciplined, restrained, and dependable, while also being quietly monitored and subtly distanced from the center of power. This contradiction became the foundation of his worldview. Under Fugaku's leadership, the Uchiha clan embodied composure. They followed village law. They excelled in their duties. They upheld order as the police force with unwavering consistency. Yet beneath this professionalism lay a growing sense of stagnation. The clan was no longer evolving emotionally. Instead, it was enduring. The curse of hatred, once shaped by grief and loss, now fed on frustration and invisibility. The Uchiha began to notice patterns that could no longer be ignored. Key decisions were made without their input. Positions of influence were consistently filled by others. The village spoke of unity, yet rarely sought the Uchiha's voice when defining its future. Each omission reinforced the belief that the clan was valued more for its utility than its perspective. Loyalty was expected, but trust was never fully returned. This slow erosion of belonging did not produce immediate anger. It produced quiet resentment. The curse of hatred thrives in this space. It does not require dramatic injustice. It grows strongest in prolonged imbalance, where effort goes unrecognized and patience yields nothing. For the Uchiha, decades of restraint had produced no closer integration, no deeper trust, no release from historical suspicion. Peace had become static, and stagnation felt indistinguishable from containment. Fugaku faced an impossible position as clan leader. He was responsible not only for maintaining order, but for protecting the emotional dignity of his people. He understood the village's fear of the Uchiha, yet he also understood the cost of endless restraint. The clan's younger members were growing restless, not because they desired conflict, but because they could feel the weight of unspoken limitation pressing down on them. This was not rebellion. It was exhaustion. The curse of hatred evolved once more, transforming frustration into ideology. The idea began to form that perhaps the village could not change from within, that perhaps the systems meant to preserve peace were the very structures preventing true equality. This belief did not arise suddenly. It accumulated slowly, reinforced by years of observation and quiet disappointment. The Uchiha did not want destruction. They wanted acknowledgement. Yet acknowledgement requires vulnerability, and vulnerability was something the village had never been willing to risk with them. The more the clan restrained itself, the more invisible it became. The curse of hatred interpreted this invisibility as confirmation that patience alone would never resolve their situation. Within the clan, conversations shifted, not toward violence, but toward inevitability. The question was no longer whether the village mistrusted them, but whether that mistrust would ever fade. the answer increasingly felt like no. For Fugaku, the weight of this realization was heavy. He was not driven by ambition or hunger for power. He was driven by responsibility. Every decision he made had to balance loyalty to the village with loyalty to his people. And the two were drifting further apart with each passing year. The curse of hatred pressed upon him not as rage, but as resignation. The idea of a coup did not emerge as a desire for domination. It emerged as a last resort. Within the Uchiha philosophy, control had always been a response to helplessness. When the world refused to acknowledge suffering, the instinct was to impose structure where none existed. This was the same instinct that had driven Madara generations earlier, though now it was quieter, more restrained, and framed as necessity rather than ideology. At the same time, the village leadership watched the Uchiha with growing concern. Increased isolation was interpreted as secrecy. Emotional withdrawal was mistaken for plotting. The curse of hatred fed on this mutual misinterpretation, strengthening itself through mirrored suspicion. Neither side fully understood the other, yet both believed they were acting to prevent disaster. This is where tragedy takes root. The Uchiha believed they were running out of time. The village believed it was running out of trust. Communication narrowed. Silence deepened. Each side prepared for a future shaped by fear rather than understanding. The curse of hatred did not scream. It waited. Within the clan, the younger generation felt the pressure without fully understanding its source. They sensed tension in the air, absorbed it through tone and behavior rather than explanation. They were taught discipline without context, loyalty without reassurance, strength without release. The curse of hatred became generational once more, passed down not through trauma, but through atmosphere. One child, in particular, would be shaped profoundly by this environment. Born into the heart of this quiet fracture, he would grow up absorbing the weight of expectation, restraint, and looming inevitability without ever being told the full truth. The curse of hatred would shape him not as anger, but as responsibility far beyond his years. And in trying to protect the village from itself, he would be asked to commit the very act that would define the curse forever. Itachi Uchiha was born into a moment where the curse of hatred no longer needed to announce itself. It existed everywhere around him, embedded in silence, expectation, and restraint. He did not grow up hearing stories of ancient wars in vivid detail, nor was he raised amid open conflict. Instead, he was shaped by something far more subtle and far more demanding: the quiet pressure of being born into a fracture that no one was willing to explain to him. From a young age, Itachi displayed an unusual sensitivity to the emotional undercurrents of the world. He noticed tension before words were spoken, sensed unease before it was acknowledged, and understood grief long before he experienced it directly. This sensitivity was not celebrated as intuition. It was cultivated as responsibility. The curse of hatred recognized something in him immediately. Not rage, but awareness. And awareness, within the Uchiha philosophy, carried weight. Itachi witnessed death early, not as chaos, but as an inevitability. The aftermath of the Third Great Ninja War left impressions on him that would never fade. He saw bodies carried home quietly. He saw adults speak in careful tones. He observed how grief was absorbed rather than expressed. This environment taught him that emotion was dangerous when visible, that sorrow must be managed rather than felt. The curse of hatred began shaping him, not through trauma alone, but through expectation. Unlike many Uchiha before him, Itachi did not respond to this pressure with resentment. He responded with reflection. He questioned why suffering existed at all, why people continued cycles that led only to loss, and why peace always seemed temporary. These questions did not make him rebellious. They made him cautious. He did not seek power for its own sake. He sought understanding, believing that if the world could be understood deeply enough, it might be prevented from repeating itself. This mindset set him apart. Within the clan, Itachi was praised for his talent, yet subtly burdened by it. He excelled academically and militarily, advancing faster than his peers, but each achievement carried an unspoken message. You are different, and difference demands responsibility. The curse of hatred fed on this distinction, reframing his success not as personal growth, but as obligation. As Itachi grew older, the tension between the Uchiha and the village became more pronounced. Conversations grew quieter. Meetings became more secretive. The idea of a coup, once distant and theoretical, began to take shape as a real possibility. Yet Itachi stood at the intersection of two worlds. As a member of the clan, he inherited its pain and frustration. As a shinobi of the village, he was taught to prioritize stability above all else. This duality fractured him internally. The curse of hatred had always thrived on division, but now it took a new form. It placed Itachi in a position where every choice carried irreversible consequence. Loyalty to one side meant betrayal of the other. Neutrality was impossible. Silence became complicity. Action became tragedy. The village recognized Itachi's intelligence and emotional restraint, and placed trust in him that bordered on exploitation. He was recruited into ONBU at an age when most children were still learning who they were. In this environment, he was exposed to the village's deepest fears and contingency plans. He learned that the leadership believed the Uchiha coup was inevitable, that war within the village was considered a greater threat than the loss of a single clan. This knowledge altered Itachi permanently. He realized that the village, like the Uchiha, was acting out of fear rather than malice. Both sides believed they were preventing catastrophe. Both sides believed sacrifice was necessary. The curse of hatred, which had once driven individuals toward domination, now manifested as institutional logic. Suffering was no longer personal. It was strategic. Itachi internalized this logic completely. He came to believe that peace was fragile not because people were evil, but because fear demanded preemptive action. If conflict was inevitable, then perhaps it could be controlled. If suffering was unavoidable, then perhaps it could be limited. This belief did not erase his love for his family. It sharpened it painfully. Love became something to be protected at the cost of self. Within Uchiha philosophy, this was the most extreme evolution of the curse of hatred. Hatred was no longer directed outward. It was turned inward. Itachi accepted the role of villain willingly, believing that absorbing hatred himself could spare others from it. This was not madness. It was logic, shaped by generations of unresolved grief. He believed that if one person could carry the weight of the curse alone, perhaps it could finally end. The night of the massacre was not driven by rage or ambition. It was driven by exhaustion. Itachi stood between two futures, both catastrophic, and chose the one that would end the fastest. In doing so, he embodied the Uchiha philosophy in its most tragic form, the belief that love requires sacrifice, that peace requires suffering, and that bearing hatred alone is preferable to allowing it to spread. The curse of hatred did not end that night. It transformed again. By sparing Sasuke, Itachi passed the curse forward in its rawest form. Sasuke would inherit not just trauma, but unanswered questions. He would grow up believing hatred was truth, that vengeance was purpose, and that love inevitably betrayed. The curse shifted from restraint to obsession, from silence to fixation. For Itachi, survival after the massacre was its own punishment. He lived as a symbol of hatred, ensuring the village's peace at the cost of his humanity. He became the embodiment of the curse, carrying it openly so others would not have to. This was not redemption. It was endurance taken to its final extreme. In the end, Itachi's philosophy reflected the deepest tragedy of the Uchiha. They did not lack compassion. They lacked permission to be human. And so the curse of hatred continued, not as fire, but as legacy, passed from brother to brother, waiting for someone who could endure it without becoming consumed. Sasuke Uchiha was born into silence long before he understood what silence meant. Unlike previous generations of the clan, he did not inherit stories of war or ideological conflict. He inherited absence. The curse of hatred did not arrive in his life as philosophy or history, but as a void where warmth, explanation, and certainty should have been. From the beginning, his world was shaped less by what happened and more by what was never spoken. In his earliest memories, Sasuke's home was still full. His parents were distant but present. His brother admired and untouchable. And the clan existed as a quiet structure around him. He did not yet feel the weight carried by those older than him. He only sensed that something about the world was restrained, held tightly in place. Even before the massacre, Sasuke grew up surrounded by emotional distance. Love existed, but it was rarely expressed openly. Pride replaced affection. Expectation replaced reassurance. This emotional atmosphere prepared him unknowingly for what would come. When the massacre occurred, it did not simply shatter Sasuke's life. It redefined reality itself. In a single night, the clan vanished. His parents were erased, and his understanding of the world collapsed into a single image. His brother, standing amid the aftermath, calm, composed, and incomprehensible. This moment did not just awaken Sasuke's Sharingan. It rewrote the structure of his mind. The curse of hatred entered him fully, not as inherited memory, but as lived truth. For Sasuke, hatred became the only stable element in a world that no longer made sense. Love had disappeared without warning. Safety had proven illusory. Trust had become meaningless. Hatred, however, offered clarity. It pointed in a direction. It promised purpose. The curse of hatred did not whisper to him about power or destiny. It told him something simpler and more seductive, that if he focused all his pain into a single objective, the chaos inside him might become manageable. Unlike Itachi, Sasuke did not suppress his emotions. He organized them. Grief was converted into fixation. Loneliness became ambition. Anger became fuel. The curse of hatred reshaped itself once again, evolving from silent endurance into identity. Sasuke did not merely feel hatred. He became it, because without it, there was nothing left to define him. In the village, Sasuke existed as both orphan and symbol. He was pitied quietly, admired cautiously, and monitored subtly. The village saw him as the last Uchiha, a survivor to be protected. Sasuke experienced this protection as isolation. He was surrounded by people yet fundamentally alone, his pain acknowledged, but never shared. No one could speak to him about the clan, because the clan itself had become taboo. This reinforced the curse. When pain is not acknowledged openly, it grows inward. Sasuke learned that no one could truly understand him, that his grief was his alone to bear. This belief hardened into certainty. He stopped seeking comfort. He stopped expecting understanding. Instead, he measured his worth through progress, through strength, through skill, through how close he felt to his goal. The memory of Itachi became both wound and compass. Sasuke replayed it endlessly, not because he enjoyed suffering, but because it was the only connection he had left. Hatred preserved memory. Without it, the past might fade. The curse of hatred taught him that letting go was equivalent to betrayal. To forget would be to accept the loss as final. And Sasuke was not ready to live in a world where such loss could exist without meaning. As he trained, Sasuke internalized a version of the Uchiha philosophy stripped of context. Power was not a means to protect others. It was a means to close the distance between himself and the source of his pain. The Sharingan did not awaken through new trauma. It sharpened through obsession. Each improvement felt like proof that suffering could be transformed into progress. Yet beneath this drive lay deep exhaustion. Sasuke's childhood became defined by comparison. He measured himself against peers who had families, stability, and futures not shaped by vengeance. This difference deepened his sense of separation. Even moments of connection felt temporary, fragile, and ultimately irrelevant compared to his goal. The curse of hatred demanded exclusivity. Anything that distracted from revenge felt like weakness. When Sasuke finally chose to leave the village, it was not because he hated it. It was because he believed it couldn't give him what he needed. The village represented restraint, patience, and gradual growth. Sasuke believed time itself was his enemy. Every day spent not pursuing power felt like a betrayal of the dead. The curse of hatred framed departure not as abandonment, but as necessity. Under Orochimaru, Sasuke embraced a philosophy that mirrored his internal state. Power without attachment. Progress without morality. Growth without reflection. This environment validated his belief that emotion was a tool, not something to be healed. Pain became something to sharpen rather than soothe. The curse of hatred intensified, shedding its earlier forms of grief and silence and becoming pure momentum. Yet even here, Sasuke was not free from contradiction. He despised the manipulation he endured, yet accepted it. He rejected bonds, yet felt their absence acutely. The curse of hatred does not erase humanity. It buries it beneath purpose. Sasuke continued forward, because stopping would mean confronting the emptiness beneath his hatred. When the truth of Itachi's sacrifice was finally revealed, the curse of hatred shattered and reassembled itself instantly. Hatred redirected outward toward the village, the system, and the world that had forced his brother into damnation. Sasuke's identity collapsed once again, leaving behind something colder and more abstract. Vengeance was no longer personal. It became ideological. This was the curse at its most dangerous. Hatred was no longer anchored to a single target. It expanded to encompass reality itself. Sasuke questioned the legitimacy of peace, justice, and authority. He saw systems as inherently corrupt, built on sacrifice of the few for the comfort of the many. The curse of hatred convinced him that the world was fundamentally dishonest, and that destruction might be the only honest response. Yet even in this state, Sasuke carried the core of the Uchiha philosophy unchanged. He did not seek chaos for pleasure. He sought meaning for suffering. His hatred was not empty. It was searching desperately for something solid enough to justify everything that had been lost. The curse of hatred had shaped him completely, but it had not yet finished with him. Because beyond hatred, beyond vengeance, beyond ideology, there remained one final question the Uchiha philosophy had never answered. whether it was possible to acknowledge pain fully without being consumed by it. That answer would not come from the past. It would come from confrontation. Sasuke's path eventually led him back toward the one presence he had tried hardest to separate himself from. Naruto Uzumaki was not simply a rival, nor merely a reminder of the village Sasuke had abandoned. He was something far more threatening to the curse of hatred itself. Where Sasuke embodied memory, loss, and fixation, Naruto represented persistence, connection, and the refusal to let pain define the future. Their existence side by side was not coincidence. It was collision. From the beginning, Naruto disrupted Sasuke's internal logic. Naruto had experienced isolation, grief, and rejection, yet he refused to organize his suffering into hatred. He acknowledged pain openly, allowed it to exist without shaping his entire identity around it, and continued reaching outward despite repeated disappointment. To Sasuke, this behavior seemed naive at best and delusional at worst. The curse of hatred whispered that Naruto's optimism was fragile, that it would shatter under sufficient loss, just as everything else had. Yet it never did. Each time Naruto suffered, he returned unchanged in his core belief that bonds mattered, that people could grow, and that pain did not need to be repaid in kind. This consistency unsettled Sasuke deeply. It suggested that suffering might not demand the conclusions Sasuke had drawn. The curse of hatred responded defensively, urging Sasuke to reject Naruto's presence entirely. If Naruto was right, then Sasuke's entire existence would be built on a false premise. Their confrontations were never truly about strength. They were philosophical disputes expressed through combat. Sasuke fought to prove that hatred was inevitable, that loss necessitated severance, and that bonds were weaknesses waiting to be exploited. Naruto fought to demonstrate that endurance without isolation was possible, that bonds could survive suffering, and that meaning could be found beyond revenge. Each clash intensified the curse of hatred rather than resolving it. Sasuke interpreted Naruto's refusal to abandon him as intrusion. The curse reframed persistence as control, compassion as ignorance. Sasuke told himself that Naruto could not understand him, because to understand him would mean accepting pain without letting it rule everything. As Sasuke descended deeper into ideological extremism, the curse of hatred expanded beyond revenge and into the realm of cosmic judgment. He no longer sought to punish specific individuals. He sought to reshape the world's moral structure entirely. The cycle of hatred, as he understood it, could not be broken through forgiveness or compromise. It required radical intervention. Sasuke's belief crystallized into a single conclusion: peace built on sacrifice was not peace. Justice built on secrecy was not justice. A world that required children like Itachi to suffer silently was not worth preserving as it was. The curse of hatred reached its apex here, no longer fueled by personal loss, but by philosophical absolutism. Sasuke believed that by positioning himself as the ultimate enemy, he could absorb the world's hatred and force unity through opposition. This mirrored Itachi's logic, but stripped of compassion and restraint. Where Itachi sacrificed himself quietly, Sasuke intended to sacrifice the world's existing order openly. Naruto stood in direct opposition to this vision. He did not deny the world's cruelty. He did not dismiss the pain that shaped Sasuke's beliefs. Instead, he rejected the conclusion that pain demanded domination or destruction. Naruto believed that suffering could be confronted collectively rather than redirected. He did not seek to erase the past. He sought to live with it without allowing it to dictate every choice. This difference was fundamental. The curse of hatred could not easily dismiss Naruto, because Naruto acknowledged pain without being consumed by it. He did not ask Sasuke to forget the Uchiha. He asked him to remember them without allowing their deaths to define the future entirely. This request struck at the heart of the curse. It suggested that remembrance and healing were not mutually exclusive. Their final confrontation was not simply the culmination of rivalry. It was the final test of the Uchiha philosophy itself. Sasuke fought to affirm the necessity of hatred. Naruto fought to prove that hatred, while understandable, was not inevitable. Every blow exchanged carried centuries of unresolved grief, mistrust, and longing. In the aftermath, exhaustion replaced certainty. Sasuke found himself confronted not with defeat, but with endurance. Naruto remained standing, not because he was stronger, but because he refused to let go. This persistence forced Sasuke to confront a possibility he had never allowed himself to consider: that hatred, while powerful, was not the only response to loss. The curse of hatred began to loosen its grip, not because Sasuke forgave the world, but because the world refused to abandon him in return. Naruto's willingness to shoulder pain alongside him rather than oppose it destabilized the curse's core assumption: that suffering must always be carried alone. For the first time, Sasuke experienced shared burden without domination. This moment did not erase his past. It reframed it. The curse of hatred did not shatter completely. It receded, retreating from identity into memory. Sasuke did not become free of grief. He became capable of living with it, without allowing it to dictate his purpose entirely. This was the first true deviation from the Uchiha pattern in generations. For the Uchiha philosophy, this moment marked a turning point. The clan's history had been defined by love turning into loss, loss turning into hatred, and hatred turning into power. Sasuke's survival represented a different conclusion: that love could endure loss without transforming into destruction. This did not invalidate the suffering of the past. It gave it context. In choosing to live rather than dominate, Sasuke accepted responsibility not as punishment, but as continuation. He became a bridge between eras, carrying the memory of the curse without perpetuating it. This was not redemption. It was evolution. The curse of hatred had shaped the Uchiha for centuries. For the first time, it did not have the final word. After the final confrontation faded and the dust of conflict settled, the curse of hatred did not disappear in a dramatic or definitive way. It did not shatter, nor did it dissolve into nothingness. Instead, it entered its quietest and most complex phase. For the first time in Uchiha history, hatred was no longer the engine driving the future. It became something else entirely: memory, responsibility, and lingering weight rather than destiny. Sasuke did not emerge from the conflict transformed into someone new. He emerged as someone exhausted. The clarity that hatred once provided was gone, replaced by a vast, unfamiliar silence. For most of his life, hatred had organized his thoughts, shaped his identity, and given him direction. Without it, he was forced to confront a reality he had never prepared for, one where pain existed without a singular purpose, and where the future was not already written by the past. This was not peace. It was aftermath. The curse of hatred had always thrived in certainty, even if that certainty was cruel. It told the Uchiha who they were, what they had lost, and what must be done in response. Now, that voice was quieter, less commanding. Sasuke found himself surrounded by memory, without instruction. The faces of his clan, his parents, his brother, and every decision he had made lingered without resolution. The curse had loosened its grip, but the scars remained. For the first time, Sasuke began to understand the full weight of what the curse of hatred had done to his clan across generations. It had not only shaped their actions, but had narrowed their emotional possibilities. It had convinced them that pain must always lead somewhere specific, that suffering required recompense, that grief demanded transformation into power. Without that framework, the Uchiha had been left unprepared to simply live with loss. This realization marked a fundamental shift. Sasuke no longer sought to correct the world through force or ideology. He began to see that the greatest damage inflicted by the curse of hatred was not destruction, but reduction. The reduction of human experience into cycles of reaction. The Uchiha had not been allowed to grieve freely, to heal openly, or to exist without expectation. Their philosophy had evolved in response to trauma, but had never escaped it. As Sasuke distanced himself from the village to travel alone, this understanding deepened. His wandering was not an escape, but a process of reckoning. Each place he visited, each conflict he observed, mirrored fragments of the world that had shaped the Uchiha. Everywhere he went, he saw the same patterns repeating: fear hardening into control, loss turning into violence, and ideals collapsing under unresolved grief. The curse of hatred, he realized, was not unique to the Uchiha. It was simply concentrated within them. This realization did not absolve the clan of responsibility, but it contextualized their suffering. The Uchiha had been early witnesses to a truth the world refused to acknowledge. that unaddressed pain does not fade. It accumulates. It waits. And when ignored long enough, it reshapes everything around it. Sasuke began to understand Itachi differently during this time, not as a martyr nor as a villain, but as a product of an impossible system. Itachi had carried the curse inward to prevent it from spreading outward. Sasuke had attempted to externalize it, believing destruction was the only honest response. Both approaches had failed in their own ways. Neither had allowed the curse to truly resolve. What was missing was not strength or sacrifice. It was acknowledgement. The Uchiha philosophy had never made space for open grief. It revered endurance, restraint, and control, but never vulnerability. This omission had forced each generation to find destructive outlets for pain that had no language. Sasuke's survival represented the first time an Uchiha was allowed to feel grief without being immediately told what to do with it. This was unprecedented. As time passed, Sasuke's role in the world became quieter, but more meaningful. He no longer sought to define the future through force. Instead, he observed it, intervening only when cycles threatened to repeat themselves. This vigilance was not fueled by hatred, but by memory. The curse of hatred had transformed into awareness, a reminder of what happens when pain is ignored rather than addressed. In this way, Sasuke became something entirely new within Uchiha history. He was not a leader commanding others, nor a rebel opposing systems, nor a sacrifice absorbing hatred. He became a witness, a carrier of memory without compulsion. This subtle shift represented the most profound change the Uchiha philosophy had ever undergone. Hatred was no longer the organizing principle. Responsibility was. The clan itself no longer existed as it once had. The Uchiha were gone, reduced to stories, records, and the lingering fear attached to their name. Yet their philosophy survived, transformed through Sasuke's continued existence. The curse of hatred, once bound to bloodline and trauma, had been loosened from inevitability. It became a caution rather than a prophecy. For the world, this change went largely unnoticed. Villages continued to operate, conflicts still emerged, and peace remained fragile. Yet beneath these familiar patterns, something had shifted. The last bearer of the Uchiha curse was no longer consumed by it. This did not end suffering, but it interrupted the certainty that suffering must always reproduce itself. The true legacy of the Uchiha was not their power, nor their downfall. It was their emotional honesty, long buried beneath survival. Their story revealed the cost of unresolved grief, the danger of silence, and the consequences of systems that value stability over healing. The curse of hatred was never supernatural. It was human, amplified through generations that were never allowed to stop and mourn. Sasuke carried this understanding forward quietly. He did not preach it. He did not codify it into law. He lived it. By refusing to let hatred define his future, He altered the trajectory of a philosophy centuries in the making. The curse was not erased, but it was no longer in control. For the first time, the Uchiha story did not end in tragedy. It ended in continuation. Over time, the curse of hatred began to change its shape once again, not within a single person, but within the collective memory of the world itself. As the year passed, and those who had directly witnessed the Uchiha faded into history, the meaning of the curse became increasingly abstract. It was spoken of less as a lived experience and more as a concept, a warning, a simplified explanation attached to a name that no longer walked among the villages. In this distance, something subtle but important occurred. The curse was remembered, but it was no longer understood. Stories about the Uchiha hardened into symbols. Their eyes became shorthand for danger. Their emotions were reduced to instability. The complexity of their suffering, the long accumulation of grief and loss that had shaped their philosophy, was compressed into a single narrative that was easier to repeat than to examine. The curse of hatred became a label that justified fear rather than a lesson that demanded reflection. In this way, the world preserved the result of the curse while forgetting its cause. This misunderstanding was not accidental. Societies often prefer myths that protect them from responsibility. To acknowledge the true nature of the curse of hatred would require confronting the systems that created it. The endless wars, the weaponization of children, the suppression of grief, and the expectation that loyalty must override humanity. It was easier to believe the Uchiha were simply different, inherently volatile, rather than shaped by circumstances no one wanted to fully address. Yet the curse never belonged solely to the Uchiha. It had merely found its most concentrated expression within them. Across the world, the same emotional patterns continued to repeat themselves in quieter ways. Shinobi who lost comrades learned to bury their grief beneath duty. Villages that endured destruction rebuilt without allowing themselves to mourn what had been lost. Children inherited unresolved pain through silence rather than instruction. The curse of hatred persisted, not as a bloodline trait, but as a cultural habit, one that discouraged vulnerability and rewarded emotional suppression. Sasuke understood this as he watched from the margins. He recognized the early signs of the curse wherever they appeared. The rigid certainty that followed loss, the need to assign blame, the belief that strength required emotional isolation. He did not intervene often, but when he did, it was rarely through combat. Sometimes it was a conversation. Sometimes it was presence. Sometimes it was simply refusing to validate hatred as an answer. This restraint marked another evolution of the Uchiha philosophy. Power, once measured through dominance and fear, was now expressed through patience. The Sharingan, once awakened through loss, had become a reminder rather than a trigger. The eyes that once reflected rage now carried memory, quiet, heavy, and unyielding. In this sense, Sasuke became a living contradiction to the legend of his clan. He embodied everything the world believed the Uchiha could never be: stable without suppression, powerful without conquest, reflective without detachment. His existence quietly challenged the myth of inevitability that surrounded the curse of hatred. He proved that awareness could interrupt cycles without erasing history. The irony was that this transformation went largely unnoticed. Legends favor spectacle. They remember battles, not restraint. They preserve moments of destruction, not years of quiet responsibility. As a result, the world continued to speak of the Uchiha as if they had ended where they fell, consumed by hatred, erased by their own emotions. The truth was slower and less dramatic. The curse had not been defeated in a single moment. It had been outgrown. This distinction matters. Defeat implies opposition. Outgrowing implies understanding. The curse of hatred could not be destroyed because it was never an external force. It was an emotional response shaped by environment, repeated through generations, and reinforced by silence. Ending it required something far more difficult than strength. It required the willingness to sit with pain without immediately transforming it into action. The Uchiha had never been allowed that space. Their history had been one long acceleration: conflict followed by retaliation, grief followed by resolve, loss followed by escalation. Each generation inherited momentum rather than choice. Sasuke's refusal to continue accelerating marked the first true pause in the clan's philosophy. That pause changed everything. As the world moved forward, the curse of hatred became something like a shadow beneath its progress. It no longer dictated outcomes, but it lingered as a possibility. The lesson of the Uchiha remained available to those willing to see it. Pain unexamined does not disappear, and power built on unresolved grief always demands payment later. In this way, the Uchiha story transcended clan and bloodline. It became a mirror held up to the shinobi world as a whole. The curse was not a flaw unique to one family, but a warning about what happens when systems value endurance over healing, obedience over honesty, and stability over emotional truth. Sasuke's quiet vigilance ensured that this warning did not fade entirely. He carried the memory of his clan not as a burden of vengeance, but as a responsibility of awareness. The curse of hatred, once bound tightly to the Uchiha name, now existed as a lesson written into history rather than a destiny written into blood. And so, the philosophy that once demanded hatred as proof of love finally softened. Love no longer required suffering. Pain no longer demanded transformation. The curse, at last, was allowed to rest. As the years continued to pass, the curse of hatred settled into its most elusive form. It was no longer visible through conflict, no longer easily traced through bloodline or clan, and no longer announced by violence. Instead, it lived quietly within the structures of memory, expectation, and silence. This final stage of the curse was not loud, but it was persistent, woven into the way the world remembered the Uchiha and the way it chose to forget them at the same time. The Uchiha were remembered as a cautionary tale, but rarely as a human one. Their story was flattened into warnings told to children, into historical footnotes meant to justify fear or distance. What was lost in this retelling was the emotional truth of the clan, the reality that their hatred had always been born from love that had nowhere to go. The curse of hatred was never about destruction for its own sake. It was about attachment taken to its breaking point, about bonds that refused to fade even after they had been severed. This nuance faded as the world simplified its past. In doing so, it unknowingly preserved the very conditions that had created the curse in the first place. Pain was still expected to be endured quietly. Grief was still treated as weakness. Strength was still measured by emotional restraint rather than emotional honesty. The curse of hatred did not need the Uchiha to survive. It only needed a world unwilling to slow down long enough to feel. Sasuke became increasingly aware of this contradiction. The clan that had been blamed for embodying hatred had also been one of the few to confront it directly. The Uchiha never pretended pain did not exist. They acknowledged it, embraced it, and allowed it to shape them, even when it consumed them. Other villages buried their pain beneath structure and protocol, dispersing it so evenly that it became invisible. The curse, in these cases, did not explode. It diffused. This realization deepened Sasuke's quiet sense of responsibility. He did not see himself as a savior or a guide. He saw himself as a reminder. His presence alone carried the weight of unresolved history, a living testament to what happens when love is denied its natural expressions. Wherever he went, he carried the silence of his clan with him, not as a threat, but as a question the world rarely wanted to answer. What made the curse of hatred so enduring was not its intensity, but its logic. It offered clarity in moments of emotional chaos. It told the suffering that their pain mattered because it could be used. It promised meaning through reaction. For generations of Uchiha, this logic was comforting, even when it was destructive. Without it, pain felt directionless, and directionless pain is one of the most difficult human experiences to endure. Breaking free from the curse required learning how to suffer without turning suffering into identity. This was the hardest lesson the Uchiha philosophy had never taught. Sasuke's survival marked the first sustained attempt to live within that space. He did not resolve his pain by conquering it, nor by erasing it. He carried it forward, allowing it to exist without demanding it justify itself. This quiet endurance, so different from the rigid endurance of the past, represented the true philosophical evolution of the Uchiha legacy. The curse of hatred, at this stage, became less about hatred itself and more about fear. The fear of vulnerability, the fear of grief without purpose, the fear of loving deeply without guarantees. These fears were universal, but the Uchiha had been the ones to experience them most intensely. Their eyes, capable of perceiving patterns others missed, had also forced them to see loss more clearly, to feel betrayal more sharply, and to remember longer than most. This heightened perception was both their gift and their undoing. As the clan disappeared, the world lost one of its most honest mirrors. Without the Uchiha to reflect the cost of emotional suppression back at society, the shinobi world risked repeating the same mistakes under different names. The curse of hatred, stripped of its symbolism, continued quietly, manifesting in systems that prioritized mission over humanity, in children trained to accept loss before they understood it, and in leaders who mistook emotional distance for wisdom. Sasuke's quiet resistance to this pattern was subtle, but meaningful. He refused to let pain become spectacle. He refused to let memory become myth. He spoke rarely of his clan, but when he did, he spoke of them as people rather than symbols. This act alone disrupted the narrative that had reduced the Uchiha to an abstract threat. It reintroduced humanity where legend had taken over. In doing so, Sasuke fulfilled a role no previous Uchiha had been allowed to play. He became the final interpreter of the clan's philosophy, not through doctrine or declaration, but through lived example. His life demonstrated that the curse of hatred was not a fate, but a response. And responses can change. This reframing altered the emotional gravity of the Uchiha story. It no longer existed solely as a tragedy. It became a long, painful study of what happens when love is denied safety. The curse of hatred was revealed as a warning about imbalance, not between clans or ideologies, but between strength and vulnerability. As the world slowly moved further away from the era of endless war, the lessons of the Uchiha grew quieter, but no less relevant. Peace did not erase grief. Stability did not undo memory. The curse did not vanish simply because its most visible carriers were gone. It remained dormant, waiting for moments when pain was once again ignored rather than understood. In this sense, the curse of hatred became timeless, not because it was inevitable, but because it was always possible. The Uchiha story did not end with hatred consuming the world, nor with love magically overcoming it. It ended with something far more realistic and far more fragile: awareness. Awareness that pain does not need to be weaponized to be valid. Awareness that love does not require suffering to prove its depth. Awareness that the greatest strength is not the ability to endure endlessly, but the courage to stop enduring alone. This awareness was the final gift of the Uchiha. It did not come easily. It came through centuries of loss, misinterpretation, and silence. It came through brothers turning against each other, children inheriting wars they did not start, and a clan bearing the emotional cost of an entire world's unresolved grief. That cost was enormous, and it could not be undone. But it could be understood. And in understanding, the curse of hatred finally loosened its hold, not through force, not through victory, but through reflection. As the Uchiha faded from living memory and passed fully into history, the curse of hatred entered a stage that was neither dramatic nor visible. It became quiet, woven into assumptions rather than actions, into habits rather than decisions. This was the most enduring form of the curse, because it no longer felt like hatred at all. It felt like normalcy. It lived in the unspoken rules of the world, in what people expected from themselves and from one another when loss occurred. The Uchiha had once embodied emotional intensity in a way that unsettled everyone around them. Their love was deep and immediate, their loyalty unwavering, and their grief impossible to disguise. Where others learned to compartmentalize pain, the Uchiha absorbed it fully. This capacity made them powerful, but it also made them vulnerable in a world that provided no shelter for vulnerability. The curse of hatred did not arise because the Uchiha were uniquely flawed. It arose because they were uniquely honest about how much they cared. When the clan was destroyed, history rushed to simplify their story. It became easier to frame the Uchiha as inherently unstable than to acknowledge the conditions that had shaped them. The curse was spoken of as something inherited, rather than something produced. By isolating the problem within a single bloodline, the wider world absolved itself of responsibility. The endless wars, the weaponization of children, the expectation that shinobi must endure emotional trauma without complaint, all of this faded into the background. But the environment that created the curse never truly changed. Loss remained a constant. Bonds continued to form under pressure and break under violence. Shinobi still carried memories they were never taught how to process. The only difference was that without the Uchiha, these emotions no longer surfaced explosively. Pain was distributed quietly across many individuals instead of concentrated within one clan. Hatred did not disappear. It became diffuse, quieter, and more socially acceptable. This was how the curse of hatred survived its own apparent ending. Sasuke, living within this later world, could perceive this transformation with painful clarity. He no longer encountered hatred as rage or rebellion, but as emotional absence. He saw it in the way grief was acknowledged briefly and then dismissed. He saw it in leaders who had trained themselves to remain untouched by empathy, mistaking emotional distance for wisdom. He saw it in children taught discipline before they were taught how to mourn. The curse no longer needed a name or a symbol. It thrived wherever feeling was treated as an inconvenience. This understanding reframed everything the Uchiha had endured. The clan had not been destroyed by emotion itself, but by emotional isolation. Their love had been intense because it was rarely safe. Their grief had been overwhelming because it was never shared. Hatred had grown powerful because it was the only emotion that was permitted to act. In this light, the curse of hatred appeared not as a supernatural affliction, but as the natural outcome of long-term emotional neglect. The tragedy of the Uchiha was not that they felt too much. It was that they were never allowed to feel together. Over generations, pain accumulated without release. Each loss was carried forward instead of processed. Each betrayal was internalized rather than spoken. Eventually, this weight demanded expression, and hatred became the only available language. The curse was not born from cruelty, but from silence. History, however, rarely preserves this level of nuance. As time passed, the Uchiha story hardened into myth. Their suffering became a lesson told without empathy, stripped of its emotional reality. Their name became shorthand for danger rather than a reminder of consequence. This flattening was itself a continuation of the curse because it ensured that the same mistakes would be repeated under different circumstances. Sasuke's role in this era was quiet, but essential. He did not attempt to correct every misunderstanding or argue against history's version of events. Instead, he preserved the emotional truth of the Uchiha simply by living differently. He carried pain without turning it into identity. He remembered his clan without allowing memory to become justification. He allowed grief to exist without demanding it transform into action. In doing so, he embodied a version of the Uchiha philosophy that had never been allowed to exist before. This was the philosophy beneath the curse of hatred. The recognition that love creates vulnerability, and vulnerability requires protection. The Uchiha had always understood the first truth. They had never been taught the second. Without protection, vulnerability became danger. Danger demanded control. Control hardened into ideology. Over time, ideology hardened into destiny. Sasuke's survival represented the first sustained interruption of that pattern, not through strength, conquest, or sacrifice, but through restraint. He demonstrated that pain could be carried without being weaponized, and that memory could be honored without being obeyed. This quiet resistance altered the meaning of the curse more effectively than any battle ever could. In its final form, the curse of hatred no longer demanded vengeance or domination. It lingered as a subtle influence, appearing wherever pain was dismissed as weakness and emotional distance was praised as maturity. These moments were easy to overlook precisely because they seemed reasonable. Yet this was where the curse endured most effectively, hidden within ordinary expectations. In this sense, the curse became universal. No longer bound to the Uchiha, it existed as a possibility within any system that valued endurance over healing. The lesson of the Uchiha was no longer about a single clan's downfall. but about the cost of refusing to make space for human emotion. Their story asked a quiet question that echoed long after they were gone. What happens to love when it is never protected, and to grief when it is never acknowledged? The answer had already been written into history. It becomes hatred, not because hatred is inevitable, but because it is allowed to move when nothing else can. As this understanding slowly settled into the collective memory of the world, the curse of hatred lost its authority over the future. It did not vanish, but it no longer dictated what must come next. Awareness replaced inevitability. Reflection replaced myth. The Uchiha story, once feared and misunderstood, transformed into a warning rather than a prophecy. This was the most complete resolution the curse could ever receive. The Uchiha were gone, but their meaning endured. Their suffering, once dismissed or sensationalized, became a quiet lesson carried forward through understanding rather than repetition. The curse of hatred, finally seen clearly, was no longer a destiny to be inherited, but a truth to be remembered. And in that remembrance, the long cycle slowed, not all at once, but enough to change what followed. In the quiet that followed everything the Uchiha had endured, there was no sudden clarity, no single moment where meaning resolved itself neatly. The curse of hatred did not lift like a storm passing, nor did it collapse under the weight of understanding. Instead, it receded gradually, like a tide pulling back from the shore, leaving behind traces of what had once been overwhelming. This was the final form of the curse, not something dramatic or commanding, but something that could finally be observed without being obeyed. For generations, the Uchiha believed that hatred was an unavoidable continuation of love. When love was severed, hatred rushed in to preserve its intensity, to ensure that bonds were never truly lost, only transformed. This belief gave structure to grief. It made pain feel purposeful. It allowed suffering to become a source of power rather than something aimless and unbearable. In a world defined by conflict, this philosophy offered certainty, even when it destroyed those who lived by it. Yet certainty, over time, proved to be its own kind of prison. The final truth of the curse of hatred was not that hatred was stronger than love, but that hatred was easier to hold on to than grief. Grief required stillness. It required vulnerability. It required accepting loss without transforming it into action. The Uchiha were never allowed that stillness. Their world demanded reaction, demanded resolution, demanded that pain be converted into something useful. Hatred answered that demand. This was why the curse endured for so long. Only after everything else had fallen away, after the clan, the wars, the justifications, and the legends, did the deeper shape of the philosophy become visible. Hatred had never been the core of the Uchiha identity. Attachment was. Love was. Memory was. The The curse emerged when those things were left exposed in a world that punished openness. Sasuke, as the last living bearer of this inheritance, did not dismantle the curse through force or ideology. He did something far more difficult. He lived without allowing his pain to dictate his future. He did not deny what he had lost, nor did he allow it to become the lens through which he viewed everything else. This balance was fragile, imperfect, and deeply human. But it was enough. What Sasuke demonstrated, simply by continuing to exist, was that the curse of hatred was not a destiny written into blood. It was a response shaped by environment, reinforced by silence, and sustained by fear. Remove inevitability, and hatred loses its authority. It becomes one emotion among many, no longer elevated into purpose. This shift did not transform the world overnight. Pain did not disappear. Conflict did not end. But something subtle changed in the space where meaning once hardened into ideology. The Uchiha story stopped functioning as a prophecy and began functioning as a warning. Not a warning about power, but about neglect. Not a warning about emotion, but about what happens when emotion is denied safety. The world had long misunderstood the Uchiha by focusing on their actions instead of their conditions. Their rebellions were remembered, but not the pressures that shaped them. Their violence was recorded, but not the silences that preceded it. Their hatred was feared, but their grief was ignored. In this selective memory, the curse of hatred was preserved without its context, allowing it to be dismissed rather than examined. The final chapter of the Uchiha philosophy asked the world to do something it had rarely done before, to slow down and look honestly at pain without assigning it a role, to allow suffering to exist without demanding justification, to acknowledge that love does not require endurance to prove its depth. This lesson arrived too late to save the clan, but it arrived early enough to matter. As years passed and new generations grew up, hearing the Uchiha name only in stories, the emotional charge surrounding it softened. Fear faded first, then fascination. What remained was something quieter, a sense that something important had been lost, not because it was dangerous, but because it was never protected. The Uchiha did not disappear because they were too powerful. They disappeared because they were left alone with emotions no one helped them carry. In this way, the curse of hatred resolved not into triumph, but into responsibility. Responsibility to remember pain without mythologizing it. Responsibility to recognize emotional patterns before they calcify into ideology. Responsibility to create spaces where grief can be shared, rather than endured in isolation. These responsibilities were never written into law, but they existed quietly, influencing choices in ways that were difficult to trace. This was the true legacy of the Uchiha, not the Sharingan, not forbidden techniques, not tales of vengeance or sacrifice, but a lesson about what happens when love is intense and support is absent. Hatred, in the end, was revealed to be a symptom rather than a cause. It emerged when other emotions were denied expression, when grief had no listener, when memory had no acknowledgement, when vulnerability was treated as weakness rather than as a fundamental human need. The curse of hatred lost its power the moment it was understood this way. Understanding did not erase the past, but it prevented repetition. It allowed the future to be shaped by awareness rather than reflex. It created the possibility, fragile and imperfect, that pain could be carried without becoming identity, and that love could survive loss without transforming into rage. Sasuke's quiet presence at the edge of the world embodied this possibility. He was not an ending, and he was not a solution. He was evidence. Evidence that cycles could slow, that philosophies could evolve, that even the most entrenched patterns could loosen when someone refused to continue them unquestioningly. The Uchiha story, once feared as inevitable tragedy, settled into its final form not as a warning against emotion, but as a reminder of its importance. The curse of hatred did not prove that love was dangerous. It proved that love requires care, and care, when it exists, changes everything. As the world continued forward, the curse faded into something like a distant echo, still present, still possible, but no longer commanding. It waited only where pain was ignored, where grief was rushed past, where endurance was praised more than healing. In these moments, the echo stirred, and in these moments, the lesson of the Uchiha remained available. Listen. Acknowledge. Do not rush to transform pain into purpose. This was the final wisdom left behind. Not a command, not a doctrine, but a quiet understanding. And in that understanding, the curse of hatred finally came to rest, not because it was destroyed, but because it was no longer needed.